The banking institutions in the United States have a nagging problem. More than $20 billion in unclaimed monies. The birth of America gave rise to a new and revolutionary idea that a man, no matter his social class, could determine his future, make his fortune, and build a new life. The opening up of the West encouraged the belief that every man controlled his own destiny. Millions of dollars were made on the whims of chance, whether they were gamblers or miners, peddlers or farmers. Some of those fortunes became forgotten after their owners died in obscurity, never leaving a will. Of all the stories of money won and then forgotten, one stands apart from the rest. In the San Francisco vaults of Wells Fargo Bank lies what is purportedly the largest unclaimed stock certificate in the world. Its worth is estimated at $3.2 million. Who stands to inherit this fortune?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
San Francisco marks the start of the search for the heir to the $3.2 million. A great number of domestic as well as overseas financial institutions have chosen to place their headquarters here. Fortunes are spent sorting the thousands of documents that detail financial exchanges generated here. It was in the process of examining some of these records and setting up new files that Wells Fargo Bank accidentally discovered Stock Certificate 390.
The certificate epitomizes the $20 billion unclaimed in the United States today. Everyone watching this program might have had an aunt, uncle, or perhaps a great-great-grandparent who left money in an account, property, or stock that is forgotten. How would you like to inherit the $3.2 million in the Texas Pacific Land Certificate? In search of, set out to find the rightful heir. We began making a checklist of the leads that we had. First, we knew that Texas Pacific Land Trust Company had issued the certificate in 1888. Second, we knew that a New York lending firm, Blake Brothers, was involved. Third, the name Delamar was associated with the stock. How or why, we weren't sure.
The first name on the list of leads we had gathered from San Francisco research was Texas Pacific Land Trust. We traveled to Dallas, home of that corporation, in hope of learning more about the certificate. The vice president of the trust, Jim McCall, gave us our first solid bits of information.
Certificate 390 was one of the original certificates issued by the trust. It comprised 100 shares.
The certificate had originally been issued for shares of stock in T&P Railroad, which subsequently became Texas Pacific. The shares of stock represented parcels of land the railroad had received from the state of Texas in return for building a rail line from Texarkana to El Paso. Texas Pacific stock had split numerous times, and coupled with the trust's association with Texaco Oil, every original company share became worth incredible sums. Certificate 390 had become increasingly valuable because on much of the cattle grazing land it represented, oil had been discovered.
In 1954, the trust ran ads all over the country trying to find the unknown heir. I have this set of files here which represents correspondence, claimants, letters we have received from various people who think they may own it.
Texas Pacific found no one who could prove ownership. They did have records, however, that the New York lending firm, Blake Brothers, had originally purchased Certificate 390 and 4 others in 1888. All the certificates except 390 were recorded as being sold to other individuals. Only 390 had been lost. Some theorize that the mistake occurred because business records were not carefully kept before 1924, when the Securities and Exchange Commission demanded otherwise. There were other reports that possibly the certificate and any record of it were destroyed in a fire at Blake Brothers in the 1920s. The next stop, obviously, was New York and Blake Brothers. While checking business records in New York City, we discovered that the old Blake Brothers had liquidated all of their assets sometime in the mid-1950s and no longer existed. There was even an indication that Blake Brothers had begun an investigation into the whereabouts of Certificate 390. An attorney who represented Texas Pacific, Frederick Shea, explains.
They began a thorough search among their records and so forth to ascertain anything they could about why this certificate had originally been registered in their name and what had happened to it. And it turned out eventually that they couldn't find anything on it. So they came to the conclusion that since no one had claimed ownership of this certificate, which was then worth about $2 million, over all these years, and it was registered in their name, and there was no contrary evidence that they were entitled to it.
In 1952, Blake Brothers instituted a lawsuit in the New York Supreme Court, here recreated, to prove that they and they alone owned the certificate. Their case was consistently hindered by incomplete or inaccurate records. The case reached the turning point when their star witness, under oath, and who had been with the company since the late 1890s, could not remember details of transactions involving the certificate or of Texas Pacific Land Trust. It seemed that Blake Brothers could not prove ownership either. Then who was the real owner of the certificate? That left only one more lead on our checklist: the name Delamar. New York's public library houses one of the best genealogical sections in the world. Nearly any name can be traced here. Delamar was an unusual name, so we were hopeful of finding at least some information. Searcher Barbara Wager found something. There was a Delamar, a Captain Joseph Raphael Delamar, a prominent and wealthy New York citizen at the turn of the century who had emigrated from Holland. In the New York Times, we learned that upon his death in 1918, he had bequeathed great sums to medical schools, nieces and nephews, and to his only child, Alice. In that year, Alice Delamar was still in her late teens, which meant that she could still be alive today to claim her fortune. In the process of researching the Delamar name, we came across what might be another branch in the genealogical tree. A Delamar family was living today in Atlanta. We had two choices. Since we had no record of Delamar's daughter, we decided to follow up our lead in Georgia.
We have been able to trace our descendants back to around 1692.
Mr. and Mrs. Dean Delamar had compiled a family genealogy, trying to discover if they could prove any relationship to Joseph Raphael Delamar. In 1685, Louis XIV issued an edict expelling the Delamar family, along with other Huguenots or non-Catholic Frenchmen, from France. In the process of fleeing to Holland or England, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered.
On the premise that the Huguenots either went through London or England and Holland, in that Joseph Raphael was in Holland, it would I would think, would be a good connection, that the Delamars in America before Joseph were related to those in Holland. So I don't think there's any question that we can tie into Joseph Raphael.
To date, this link has not been confirmed. Then, an intriguing fact. Mr. Delamar recalled discovering a silver boomtown in Idaho, which bore the family name, Delamar. He wondered if there was a connection. We knew Captain Delamar had various mining interests. Could the captain have owned the town? We headed west toward the Idaho, Oregon, Colorado borders, where the tiny town of Delamar was located. We arrived in Delamar to find it a ghost town. The old silver mine shaft was in ruins. The main street was only a shadow of what it had been. Most of the buildings, which had been hastily constructed, had fallen into complete disrepair. Their inhabitants, including Delamar, had died or moved elsewhere. Nothing in the decaying ghost town gave us any further knowledge concerning the whereabouts of the captain or his daughter. The traditional records, marriage certificates, land deeds, wills on public file, were not helpful. We wanted to try one more possibility before leaving Idaho. Silver City, a sister town to Delamar, was in the process of being restored. It was possible that someone there would have more knowledge of Captain Delamar. Vivian Gotch is the curator of the Owyhee County Museum. She recalled a story that Delamar left Idaho as the result of a broken romance.
He did not marry until he left here. He married in New York. As I understand it, he did have a love in Silver City, and this might have been part of the reason why he left the area and never came back. But Captain Delamar, as far as I know, just had the one daughter.
Our only choice was to return to New York, where Delamar had perhaps married, and where his daughter had probably been born. One slim lead took us to Long Island. A newspaper article mentioned that in Glen Cove, Captain Delamar had built an estate called Pembroke for his daughter. We went to Robert Coles, the local Glen Cove historian, and asked him about his knowledge of the Delamar family or of Pembroke.
The beginning of the latter half of the 19th century, many people of wealth moved out here from New York and established homes, not homes similar to the early settlers. They were very simple, but they established mansions. And then a little after that, the yachting craze came in.
Mr. Coles remembered a Delamar family had once lived in the area, but did not know if any members still remained. Was it possible that Delamar, a former sea captain, built his mansion facing the sea?
I know that there were wealthy estates here. There was an estate that was known as Pembroke.
Mr. Coles agreed to guide in search of cameras to an area where many old Glen Cove estates had been built. Although our society is referenced and cross-referenced in computerized records, we found no note of Alice Delamar. The only lead we had was Mr. Coles, who knew the area. We had to rely on his memory to break the mystery of the missing heir. We did find an area that had once been called Pembroke. It was ironic that although we were searching for a person, we were reduced to looking for a landmark. When we arrived at the location, we found it overgrown, thick with weeds, poison ivy, and twisting, reedy vines.
Oh, my.
Deep within the overgrown area, we spotted remnants of a structure. It was, according to Mr. Cole's best estimates, Pembroke.
Oh, my.
Apparently, the mansion had been destroyed by fire. Virtually nothing was left. No personal effects, no papers had survived either the fire or the scavengers who surely followed.
Goodness. Never expected to find it.
There was not the tiniest scrap of evidence as to what had happened to the Delamars and where they might have gone. All we knew for sure was that Alice Delamar, the daughter of Joseph Raphael Delamar, once existed. Toward the end of World War I, she devoted a certain amount of her time to Red Cross service. Then, seemingly, she had disappeared from sight. Some say she moved to Paris for a brief period. No one was sure. Where had Alice gone? Was she still alive? If so, was it possible that she didn't know about the certificate in San Francisco? Would Alice Delamar ever claim what was rightfully hers? The affairs of New York high society at the turn of the century were well documented. Life consisted of a series of lavish parties at elaborate Park Avenue residences. The boredom was broken only by predictable trips to Europe. We reasoned that since Alice Delamar had received $10 million upon her father's death, her actions might also have been documented in publications devoted to the life of the wealthy. In one of the shadowy corners of the New York Public Library's main reading room, we began tracking Alice Delamar in the New York Social Registry. We learned that Alice had spent some time at this Madison Avenue apartment belonging to her father, and which was located next to the Henry Morgan residence. Later, she ensconced herself at this posh Park Avenue apartment house. At other times, she chose to live in West Palm Beach. One of the last listings brought us to Weston, Connecticut. It had been a month's hard work. We found her estate, and then came the greatest disappointment of all. In her declining years, Alice Delamar decided to protect her privacy by retreating inside this plant-shrouded estate. She refused to be interviewed on camera, and we respected her wishes. She did, however, provide us with some intriguing information about her father, Captain Delamar. A man named Decker approached him sometime between 1888 and 1904, possibly in Colorado. He asked for a $500 loan. Delamar, it is reported, was a tough, canny businessman who had come to the New World and literally made a fortune in various financial dealings and mining interests. Delamar demanded collateral, and Decker offered stock certificate 390, which Delamar accepted. Apparently, Decker never repaid the loan, and by default, Delamar became its owner. Through some financial connection of Delamar's, the certificate found its way to Wells Fargo Bank, where it lay undiscovered for nearly 80 years. There is one ironic twist to our story. Some probate attorneys believe that if Decker's heirs could be found, and if they repaid the $500 loan plus interest, they may be able to claim the certificate. If so, who was Decker, and who might his heirs be? In 90 years, the certificate must have passed through many hands. In places stretching from New York to Colorado to possibly Idaho. That it was discovered is perhaps the biggest surprise of all. Since the stock certificate was sold in New York, it is perhaps a safe assumption that Decker purchased it there, but never bothered to file the proper certificate of transfer indicating Blake Brothers no longer owned 390. Meanwhile, the opening up of the lands west of the Mississippi had begun a whole new age in American culture. It was a time in a young country's history when a man, any man, if he was smart and lucky enough, could make his fortune. Gold had been discovered in 1848. The migration west became a violent, surging river of men intent upon making their fortunes.
Decker could have been like any one of these men, perhaps young, green, but ready to take a chance on striking it big. Perhaps it was in Colorado or Delamar, Idaho itself, where Decker parlayed his Texas Pacific Land Trust Certificate 390 for a $500 loan that was to be his stake. Was it? We don't know.
We are sure that in San Francisco lies 3.2 million unclaimed dollars. Any one of the 59 Deckers of New York or the 160 Deckers of Idaho or Colorado might be able to claim the fortune of a lifetime. Should it be proven that Delamar is the legal owner of the certificate, there still remains some question as to who will receive the money. He had provided in his will that if Alice dies childless, her money, plus any other monies associated with his estate, be given to 3 medical schools for dietary research. Alice never married and never had any children. It is entirely possible that her money, plus that of Certificate 390, will eventually be used to benefit everyone.
Lost civilizations, extraterrestrials, myths and monsters, missing persons, magic and witchcraft, unexplained phenomena. In search of cameras are traveling the world, seeking out these great mysteries. This program was the result of the work of scientists, researchers, and a group of highly skilled technicians.